The wind did not rise the way it should have. It did not sweep through the courtyard with the natural rhythm of night air or shifting weather. It pressed inward, heavy and deliberate, as though something unseen had taken hold of the world and tightened its grip. Conversations died instantly. Even the faint rustle of leaves seemed to vanish, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Lyra felt it before anyone else could understand it. It was not simply power, it was recognition. The same presence that had brushed against her at the edge of her awakening had returned, but now it carried weight, intention, and something far more unsettling: awareness. Her breath slowed, not out of fear, but out of focus, as every instinct within her sharpened toward the source of it. The golden energy surrounding her flickered, not weakening, but reacting, as if something ancient within her had been called to attention. Around her, the pack stiffened. Wolves who had only moments ago knelt in submission began to shift uneasily, their instincts pulling them in directions they could not explain. Even the strongest among them felt it, a pressure that did not demand obedience but threatened something deeper, their sense of place in a world they had always believed they understood. Ronan's gaze darkened, his posture tightening slightly as he stepped closer to Lyra, not to shield her, but to stand where he belonged, beside her. His presence remained steady, controlled, yet even he did not ignore what pressed against the edges of his awareness. This was not a challenge of dominance. It was something far older than rank. Cale felt it differently. Where others sensed pressure, he felt displacement. Something about this presence made his own strength feel uncertain, as though the foundation he had built his identity upon had shifted without warning. His eyes moved instinctively toward Lyra, searching for confirmation, for understanding, but what he saw in her expression offered none. She was not confused. She was not afraid. She was listening. Then the voice came. It did not echo from a single direction, nor did it carry through the air in a way that could be traced. It seemed to exist everywhere at once, threading through the silence with a calm authority that made it impossible to ignore. You carry the blood, but you do not understand it. The words settled over the courtyard like a shadow, quiet yet suffocating. Several wolves instinctively lowered their heads, not in submission, but in unease. Something about the voice bypassed hierarchy entirely. It did not command, it revealed. Lyra did not move. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, steady and unshaken, though the energy around her pulsed once in response. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly, cutting through the weight that pressed against them all. Then step out of the shadows. There was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, only a demand that matched the presence that had dared to address her. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shifted again. Not outward this time, but inward, drawing toward a single point at the edge of the courtyard where the tree line met the open space. The darkness there seemed to deepen, not as an absence of light, but as something that existed beyond it. The shadows did not simply linger, they gathered. A pulse moved through them. Slow. Deliberate. Alive. The ground beneath that space darkened as if absorbing something unseen, and then, without sound or warning, a figure stepped forward. At first, it appeared almost human in shape, tall and composed, its movements controlled with unnatural precision. But the longer one looked, the more the illusion fractured. There was something wrong in the way it held itself, something that did not belong to any wolf within the known hierarchy. Its eyes lifted. And for the first time, the courtyard truly understood. They glowed. Not faintly, not subtly, but with a steady, burning intensity that mirrored Lyra's own awakening. Yet where hers carried warmth, life, and ancient authority, this was colder, sharper, stripped of anything that resembled humanity. Recognition moved through her instantly. Not familiarity. Something deeper. A connection that did not come from memory, but from blood. Her power responded before she could fully process it, rising within her without resistance, meeting the presence before her as though it had been waiting for this moment. The air between them grew heavy, charged with opposing forces that did not collide yet, but acknowledged each other completely. The figure tilted its head slightly, studying her with an interest that felt far too measured to be coincidence. "You were never meant to awaken," it said. The words carried no anger, no urgency, only certainty. Lyra's expression did not change, but the energy around her intensified, her presence sharpening as she took a single step forward. The movement was quiet, controlled, yet it carried enough weight to shift the balance of the space around her. "Then you should have killed me when you had the chance." The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. Because the question no one could answer now stood between them, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. What stood before her was not just an enemy. It was something that should not exist. Something that carried the same origin, but a very different purpose. The shift was immediate. Moments ago, the courtyard had been filled with reverence, with wolves bowed in submission to the power Lyra had revealed. Now, that same space tightened with unease, as if the ground itself no longer trusted what stood upon it. Heads that had lowered in respect now lifted in uncertainty, and the silence that followed carried something heavier than fear. It carried doubt. Because whatever had stepped out of the darkness did not belong to any order they understood. Lyra remained where she stood, unmoving, her gaze locked onto the figure as if the rest of the world had fallen away. The energy surrounding her did not waver, but it changed. It sharpened, growing more focused, more deliberate, as though something within her was recalibrating in response to what stood before her. Ronan moved then. Not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with purpose. He stepped forward until he stood at Lyra's side, his presence steady, grounded, and unmistakably equal. He did not place himself in front of her, nor did he attempt to shield her from what approached. That alone did not go unnoticed. In a world defined by dominance, where power dictated position, his choice spoke louder than any command ever could. The pack saw it. The figure saw it, and then dismissed it. Its gaze never shifted toward Ronan, not even for a moment. There was no acknowledgement, no recognition of authority, not even curiosity. To it, the Alpha King, the most powerful leader they had known, was irrelevant. That single omission sent a ripple through the wolves. Because it meant one thing. This was not a challenge for dominance. It was something beyond it. Ronan felt it, even if he did not show it. His jaw tightened slightly, his stance adjusting in a way that was almost imperceptible, but enough to signal readiness. He was measuring the presence, weighing it, searching for something familiar within it, any indication of where it belonged in the hierarchy he understood. He found nothing. And that alone was enough to confirm the truth. Whatever this was, it stood outside their world. Kale's breath came slower now, controlled but strained. His eyes moved between Lyra and the figure, searching for something to ground himself in, something to explain what he was feeling. But there was no explanation, only instinct. And his instincts were warning him. The pressure in the air intensified, pressing against his senses, against his identity, as if something deeper than strength was being tested. It was not a challenge he could meet. It was a presence he could not place himself against. "What is that?" someone whispered, their voice barely carrying across the silence. No one answered. Because no one knew. Except Lyra's expression shifted, just slightly. Not with fear. Not with uncertainty. With recognition. Her gaze narrowed as she studied the figure more closely, not just seeing it, but feeling it, tracing the energy that radiated from it in steady, deliberate waves. It was not identical to hers. There were differences, distortions, something altered within it, but beneath that, at its core, there was no denying it. It came from the same origin. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but far more certain. "It's like me." The words settled heavily, not just for those who heard them, but for what they implied. The figure's lips curved slightly, not into a smile of amusement, but something more measured, more knowing. "Not like you," it replied. Its voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Before you." The words did not echo. They settled. Deep. Final. And in that moment, the balance of everything shifted. Because those two words carried more than a statement. They carried history, hierarchy, and a truth no one in that courtyard had ever considered. Lyra was not the beginning. She was part of something older, something that had existed long before her awakening, long before the system they believed in had ever taken shape. Her power responded again, not violently, not uncontrollably, but with clarity. It rose within her, steady and aware, as if something buried deep within her blood had just been acknowledged for the first time. Ronan's gaze moved to her briefly, not in doubt, but in understanding. He did not need confirmation of what she was realizing. He could feel it. This was no longer just about strength. It was about origin. Cale felt it too, though not in the same way. For him, the realization came with something far more unsettling. The quiet, creeping awareness that everything he had believed about power, about hierarchy, about what it meant to be alpha, might not be true at all. The figure took another step forward, slow and controlled, its presence expanding with it, pressing further into the space they occupied. And Lyra did not step back. If anything, she leaned into it. Not physically, but in presence, in power. Because whatever this was, whatever it claimed to be, it did not diminish her. It revealed something else entirely. Something that had yet to be fully understood. And the question that now lingered between them was no longer simple curiosity. It was something far more dangerous. If this being came before her, then what exactly had she become? The figure did not rush forward. It did not need to. Its presence alone pressed against the world like a truth that had been buried too long to remain hidden. The air thickened further, and this time, the shift did not remain external. It reached inward. Lyra felt it first. Not as an attack. As a pull. Something within her responded, not violently, but with recognition so deep it bypassed thought entirely. Her breath slowed, her focus narrowing, as the energy in her veins shifted from reaction to memory. Then it began. Not in words. In images. They did not arrive gently. They tore through her mind in sharp, fragmented flashes, moments that did not belong to her, yet carried the unmistakable weight of truth. She saw wolves. Not like the ones she had grown up among. Stronger. Larger. Their presence alone commanded the land around them. They did not fight for dominance. They did not compete for hierarchy. They ruled through something far more absolute, an authority that did not need to be proven. Ancient alphas. The first. Their eyes burned with the same light now coursing through her, but there was no uncertainty in them, no restraint. They moved through vast territories untouched by fear, their power shaping the world rather than reacting to it. Then the images shifted. The sky darkened. The land fractured. War. Not the kind she had known through whispered stories or minor territorial disputes. This was something far greater. Entire bloodlines clashed, not for control, but for survival. The ground ran with blood, the air thick with the sound of destruction that did not end when one side fell. And then, hunting. Not battle. Not rivalry. Extermination. The ancient alphas were not losing in combat. They were being erased. One by one. Targeted. Tracked. Eliminated. Lyra's jaw tightened as the images sharpened, her body reacting even as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. This was not chaos. This was strategy. A force had risen against them, not to challenge their power, but to remove it entirely. The figure's voice cut through the storm of memory, calm and unwavering. "You were taught a story of betrayal," it said. The images slowed, focusing. A final moment. A group of ancient alphas, surrounded, outnumbered, their strength undeniable, and yet their fate sealed. They were never betrayed. The last of them fell. Silence followed. They were hunted. The words settled heavily, anchoring the truth into place. Lyra's eyes opened, sharper now, clearer. The energy around her pulsed once, not in confusion, but in alignment. The fragments had connected. The pieces had formed something undeniable. Her bloodline had not fallen to weakness. It had been targeted. Ronan watched her carefully, reading the shift in her expression, the subtle tightening of her posture. He did not interrupt, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of realization. "You're saying someone orchestrated it," he said, his tone measured, controlled. "That this was planned." The figure turned its gaze toward him then, but only briefly, as if acknowledging the statement rather than the man. "No," it replied. A pause. Just long enough to sharpen the impact of what came next. "We executed it." The courtyard seemed to freeze. Not from fear. From understanding. Kale's expression changed instantly, the weight of that admission cutting deeper than any display of power could have. This was not an enemy that had risen recently. This was something that had shaped the very structure of their world. Everything they believed about the packs, about dominance, about the hierarchy they lived by, had been built on the absence of something greater. Lyra's power flared in response, not uncontrolled, but undeniable. The ground beneath her feet cracked slightly, thin lines spreading outward as if the earth itself reacted to the shift in her understanding. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "You erased them," she said. Not a question. A confirmation. The figure did not deny it. Instead, it stepped forward again, its presence expanding, pressing further into the space around them. "We removed instability," it said. "Power without control destroys itself." The implication was clear. The ancient alphas had not been seen as rulers. They had been seen as a threat. And the system that replaced them, the packs, the ranks, the structure Lyra had suffered under, was not natural. It had been designed. Controlled. Maintained. Lyra's gaze hardened as the final realization settled into place. This was never just about what had been done to her. This was about what had been done to everything. Her past, her suffering, her exile, those were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were symptoms of something far larger, something that had been shaping the world long before she was born. Her journey was no longer about proving her strength. It was about reclaiming what had been taken, restoring what had been erased. The energy around her shifted again, no longer reactive, no longer searching. It settled into something far more dangerous, purpose. And for the first time, the figure did not look at her with quiet certainty. It watched her with attention, because the girl they had expected to break was beginning to understand exactly what she had become. The shift from silence to movement happened without warning. The figure did not announce its attack, nor did it gather power in any visible way. One moment it stood still, its presence pressing against the world with quiet certainty, and the next it moved. Not forward in a way the eye could follow, but through space itself, crossing the distance between them in a blur that felt less like speed and more like absence. Lyra did not hesitate. Her body reacted before thought could form, before fear could take shape. The energy within her surged outward in perfect alignment with the threat, meeting it head-on as if it had always known this moment would come. When their forces collided, the impact did not echo, it erupted. A violent shockwave tore through the courtyard, splitting the ground beneath them and sending cracks racing outward like fractures in glass. The force of it drove wolves backward, some losing their footing entirely, others forced to brace themselves against the sheer pressure that filled the air. Walls trembled, stones splintering under the strain, while the sky above seemed to shudder as though it had been struck. At the center of it all, Lyra stood firm. Her power did not lash out wildly. It moved with intention, controlled yet immense, shaping itself around her like a second form. The golden glow that surrounded her intensified, cutting through the darkness that pressed against it, holding its ground without retreat. The figure met her force with equal precision. Dark energy spiraled outward from it, colder, sharper, moving with a fluidity that suggested long familiarity with combat far beyond anything this courtyard had ever witnessed. Where Lyra's power burned with life, this felt refined, stripped down to its most efficient form, built not to overwhelm, but to endure. For a brief moment, neither gave way. Then Lyra pushed. It was not a reckless surge, not a desperate attempt to overpower what stood before her. It was measured, instinctive, as though something deep within her understood exactly how much force to apply and when. Her energy shifted, tightening, focusing, and then expanding again with greater intensity. The ground beneath the figure gave slightly, a subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed by anyone less aware. But Lyra saw it, and so did everyone else. Because it was enough. Enough to prove that this was not a fight she was losing. Ronan remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the clash unfolding before him. Every instinct he possessed urged him to move, to step in, to take control of the situation as he had done countless times before. Yet he did not. Not because he could not. Because he understood. This was not his battle to claim. Lyra did not need protection. She needed space. And more importantly, she deserved recognition. His posture remained steady, his presence grounded, but his attention sharpened, tracking every movement, every shift in power. He was not idle. He was observing, measuring, and most of all, trusting. Kale, on the other hand, felt the difference in a way that unsettled him deeply. The Lyra he had once known would have been overwhelmed by this kind of force. She would have struggled to stand, to breathe, to even remain conscious under the pressure of such power. But the woman before him now was something entirely different. She was not reacting in fear. She was matching it. The clash intensified again, energy folding into itself as both forces pressed harder. The air became almost impossible to breathe, thick with power that did not belong to the natural order of the pack. It felt as though the space around them could tear apart at any moment, unable to contain what had been unleashed within it. Then, with a controlled shift, Lyra stepped forward. Not physically at first, but in presence. Her power expanded outward, not in a chaotic burst, but in a steady, deliberate wave that pushed against the figure's force, forcing it to adjust, to compensate. The movement was subtle, but its effect was undeniable. The figure was driven back. Only a single step. But it was enough. The courtyard fell into stunned silence despite the lingering tremor of energy still crackling through the air. No one spoke. No one moved. Because what they had just witnessed defied everything they believed about strength, about hierarchy, about who held power in this world. Lyra did not chase the advantage. She held it. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unbroken, her gaze locked onto the figure with unwavering focus. She had not overextended herself. She had not lost control. She had taken ground and kept it. The figure stilled, its energy settling slightly as it regarded her with a new expression. Not hostility. Not surprise. Interest. It tilted its head, studying her more carefully now, as though reassessing something it had already decided upon. Impressive, it said, its tone calm, almost contemplative. Lyra did not respond immediately. The glow in her eyes intensified, not in anger, but in certainty. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that reached far beyond the physical clash they had just endured. "You're not the only one who evolved." The words hung between them, sharp and deliberate. The figure did not deny them. But it did not retreat either. Because despite the shift, despite the advantage she had gained, there was no sign of strain in its posture, no indication that it had been pushed to its limit. If anything, its presence remained steady, unchanged in its depth. Which meant one thing. This fight had not tested it fully. And whatever came next would not be so easily contained. The tension from the clash did not disappear, but Lyra chose not to feed it. The figure remained where it stood, watching, waiting, its presence still pressing against the edges of the courtyard like a storm that had not yet decided to break. Yet Lyra did something no one expected. She turned away from it. Not in surrender. In decision. Her focus shifted, not outward toward the unknown threat, but inward, toward the place where everything had begun. Toward the wolves who had once defined her worth, who had measured her existence and found it lacking. The same courtyard that had witnessed her humiliation now stood silent beneath her presence. Each step she took carried weight, not because she forced it, but because it belonged to her now. The ground that had once felt cold and unwelcoming seemed to respond differently, as though recognizing a change that could not be undone. The pack watched her move, their expressions no longer filled with arrogance or dismissal, but with something far more uncertain. Recognition. And fear. The elders, who had once spoken with unquestioned authority, stood frozen as she approached. Their composure faltered in ways they could not hide, their confidence stripped away by the reality unfolding before them. One of them stepped forward, not with dominance, but with hesitation that betrayed everything they had been. "You must understand," he began, his voice uneven despite his effort to steady it. "We acted according to what we believed was right for the pack." Lyra did not interrupt him immediately. She allowed the words to settle, not because they held value, but because she wanted them to hear themselves. Then she raised her hand. The movement was simple, almost effortless, yet the effect was immediate. The elder's words cut off as his body responded against his will, his knees giving way beneath him as an unseen force pressed him downward. The sound of impact echoed louder than it should have, not because of its volume, but because of what it represented. Power. Not taken. Not demanded. Held. "You believed what was convenient," Lyra said, her voice calm, carrying across the courtyard without strain. "You saw weakness, and you decided it defined me." Another elder shifted, as though preparing to speak, to defend, to reclaim some fragment of control, but the pressure in the air intensified before he could form a single word. His body followed the same path, forced downward into submission, his resistance dissolving under a power he could not challenge. Lyra continued forward, her gaze moving from one face to another, not searching for apology, not seeking remorse, but acknowledging the truth of what they had done. "You denied me food," she said, her tone steady, each word deliberate. "You made me work until I could no longer stand. You stripped me of dignity and called it order." A third alpha faltered under her presence, his posture collapsing as the weight of her authority settled over him. He had once laughed at her, once dismissed her existence as insignificant. Now he could not even meet her gaze. "You created a system that rewarded cruelty and called it strength." The courtyard grew quieter with each word, the silence no longer empty, but filled with the weight of accountability. Wolves who had once followed blindly now stood on the edge of something they had never been forced to confront. The truth. Cale remained where he stood, unable to move, unable to look away. Every word struck deeper than any physical force could have. He had not wielded the same overt cruelty as the others, but he had allowed it. He had stood at the top of a system that benefited him, never questioning what it cost someone else. Lyra stopped at the center of them all. Her presence expanded, not violently, but completely, filling the space with a force that left no room for denial. The pressure settled over the entire courtyard, not crushing, but undeniable. "You made me crawl," she said, her voice quieter now, yet far more powerful than before. "You reduced me to something beneath you, something unworthy of even being seen." She let the words linger, let them sink into every corner of the space they occupied. Then her gaze hardened. "And now," she continued, her tone unyielding, "you will understand what that truly means." The pressure increased. Not suddenly, not chaotically, but with precise control. One by one, wolves began to lower themselves, not all at once, not in perfect unison, but in response to something they could not resist. Some fought it, their muscles tensing, their pride refusing to yield, but it did not matter. The outcome was inevitable. Knees met the ground. First a few, then more, until the entire pack was brought down before her. Not through violence, through authority. The elders, the alphas, those who had once stood above her without question, now knelt in the same space where she had once been forced to bow. The reversal was complete, not exaggerated, not cruel, but exact. Lyra did not smile. She did not revel in it. Because this was not about humiliation. It was about truth. She looked over them, her expression steady, her presence unwavering. "This is not punishment," she said, her voice carrying clearly, reaching every wolf who had been forced to face this moment. "This is balance." The words settled differently than anything she had said before. Not as a threat, as a foundation. "You will remember what it means to lead," she continued, her gaze lingering on the elders who had shaped the system she now stood above. "Not through fear, not through cruelty, but through responsibility." No one spoke. No one dared to. Because for the first time, the pack was not responding to power out of instinct or fear alone. They were understanding it. Lyra stepped back slightly, not relinquishing her authority, but stabilizing it, allowing the pressure to ease just enough for breath to return, for movement to become possible again. The courtyard remained still. Not because they were forced to stay that way. Because they chose to. And in that choice, her authority was no longer imposed. It was recognized. The arc that had begun with her as something overlooked, dismissed, and broken had reached its conclusion. Not with destruction, but with control. And as the pack knelt before her, not in fear, but in acceptance, one truth became undeniable. She was no longer the Omega they had cast aside. She was the Alpha they now answered to. The courtyard did not return to normal after the kneeling. It settled into something quieter, heavier, as if the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. No one rushed to stand. No one spoke. The shift in power had not only been seen, it had been understood. Lyra stood at the center of it, her presence steady, her breathing even, but inside, something far more complicated moved beneath the surface. Power had come to her with clarity, with purpose, yet it had also brought something she had not expected to face so soon. Choice. Ronan stepped closer, his movement calm, measured, never intrusive. He did not reach for her, did not attempt to claim space that was not offered. Instead, he remained just within her awareness, close enough to be felt, far enough to respect the boundary she had not yet defined. "You handled that as a ruler would," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying no command, no expectation. Not just with strength, but with control. Lyra did not respond immediately. She could feel the connection between them more clearly now, no longer faint or uncertain, but steady, grounded. It did not pull at her in the way she had once imagined a bond would. It did not demand or overwhelm. It existed beside her, constant, patient, waiting without pressure. It was unfamiliar. And yet it felt right. Ronan did not push further. He did not need to. His presence alone spoke of something she had never been given before, space to stand as she was, without being shaped or diminished. Cale broke that balance. He stepped forward with hesitation that would have been unthinkable for him before, his usual confidence replaced by something far more uncertain. The distance between him and Lyra felt larger than the courtyard itself, not because of space, but because of everything that stood between them now. "Lyra," he began, his voice quieter than it had ever been, lacking the authority it once carried so easily. "I need you to hear me." Her gaze shifted to him slowly, not with anger, not with visible emotion, but with a calm that was far more difficult to face. It was not the silence of someone waiting to be convinced. It was the silence of someone who had already decided her worth. "You've said enough before," she replied, her tone even, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Cale swallowed, the weight of that truth settling heavily. He had never struggled for words in his life. Power had always made things simple for him. Now, stripped of that advantage, he had nothing but honesty, and even that felt insufficient. I didn't understand what you were, he said, forcing the words out despite the tension that tightened around him. I didn't see you clearly, but I do now. Lyra's expression did not change, but something in her gaze sharpened. That is exactly the problem, she said, her voice cutting through the space between them with quiet precision. You only see clearly when there is something to gain. The words landed harder than any physical blow could have. Cale flinched, not visibly, but in the way his posture shifted, the way his certainty faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, to argue, to explain, but nothing came that could undo what had already been said. Because it was true. He had not chosen her when she was vulnerable. He had not stood beside her when it mattered. His recognition had come only after her power had made it impossible to ignore. Lyra did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You didn't reject me because you lacked knowledge, she continued, her gaze steady, unwavering. You rejected me because I had none of the power you valued. The silence that followed was heavy, not empty, but filled with everything Cale could not deny. Ronan remained still beside her, his presence unchanged, yet the contrast between them had never been clearer. He did not interrupt. He did not claim victory in the moment. He simply stood there, offering something Cale never had, consistency without condition. Lyra felt it. The difference between the two was no longer subtle. It was defined, undeniable, rooted in more than attraction or instinct. One connection had been built on expectation, shaped by status and perception. The other existed without those limits, grounded in something far more stable. Cale took a step closer, despite everything. I was wrong, he said, his voice steadier now, not because he had regained confidence, but because he had nothing left to hide behind. And I know that doesn't change what I did, but I am asking for the chance to make it right. Lyra studied him for a moment, not searching for sincerity, but measuring it. When she spoke again, her tone remained calm but final. You are asking for a chance you never gave me. There was no anger in her words. That was what made them land so deeply. She had moved beyond that. Cale's shoulders lowered slightly, the weight of her response settling in fully. He had expected resistance. He had prepared himself for rejection. Yet facing it without hostility, without emotion, made it far harder to bear. Because it meant she no longer needed anything from him. Lyra turned her gaze away from him, not dismissing him entirely, but removing him from the center of her focus. The choice was not made in anger. It was made in clarity. Ronan stepped forward then, just slightly, his voice steady as he spoke. You do not have to decide anything now, he said, not directing the words at Cale, but at Lyra. You have already carried more than enough without being forced into another choice before you are ready. His tone did not suggest urgency. It offered patience. That alone shifted something within her. Because for the first time, she was not being pulled in two directions by expectation or pressure. She was being given space to choose without being rushed toward an answer. The tension between them remained, unresolved, deliberate. Cale stood where he was, the distance between him and Lyra unchanged. Ronan remained beside her, not closer, not further. And Lyra stood between past and present, not divided, but aware. The decision had not been made. And that uncertainty held more power than any immediate resolution ever could. The fragile stillness that followed Lyra's words did not last. It fractured. Not with sound at first, but with pressure, subtle, creeping, and unmistakable. The same presence that had stepped forward moments ago did not retreat, but something else began to shift around it, as though the space it occupied was no longer singular. Lyra felt it immediately. Not one. More. Her gaze lifted toward the tree line again, but this time she did not search for a single point. Her awareness expanded outward, tracing the disturbance as it spread, as if invisible threads were being drawn tighter around the courtyard. The figure before her exhaled slowly, almost as though it had grown bored of restraint. You're still thinking too narrowly, it said, its voice carrying a quiet certainty that cut deeper than any threat. Before anyone could respond, the darkness behind it moved again. Not as a shadow shifting with light, as something emerging. A second figure stepped forward, its form resolving from the same unnatural distortion, its presence carrying that same unsettling familiarity. Its eyes lifted, glowing with that same cold intensity, and the air grew heavier the moment it fully entered the space. The reaction from the pack was immediate. Several wolves stepped back instinctively, their control faltering as their instincts struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing. One had been difficult enough to comprehend. Two shattered whatever fragile understanding they had tried to hold onto. Then a third presence revealed itself. This one did not step fully into view at first. It lingered at the edge. Its outline less defined, yet its energy unmistakable. It did not need to advance to be felt. Its existence alone added weight to the atmosphere, reinforcing what was quickly becoming impossible to deny. This was not coincidence. This was not a single anomaly. This was a pattern. Ronan's posture shifted slightly, the calm control he maintained still intact, but sharpened now with something more deliberate. His gaze moved between the figures, not reacting impulsively, but assessing, calculating. His voice, when he spoke, remained steady. "How many of you are there?" It was not asked in fear. It was asked to define the scale of what they faced. The first figure regarded him briefly, its expression unchanged, but there was something almost amused in the stillness that followed. "Enough," it replied. The word carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. It was not meant to inform. It was meant to unsettle. Cale felt it more than anyone. His mind raced to place them within the structure he understood: alphas, rivals, outsiders, but none of those labels held. There was no hierarchy he could measure them against, no system that accounted for their existence. For the first time, he faced something that did not fit within the world he had been raised to lead. Lyra stepped forward again, her presence cutting through the rising tension with clarity. She did not retreat. She did not hesitate. Her power rose in response to theirs, not explosively, but steadily, expanding outward like a boundary being drawn. The golden energy around her intensified, pushing back against the darkness that now surrounded the courtyard from multiple directions. "If you came here to intimidate," she said, her voice controlled, unwavering, "you're wasting your time." The second figure tilted its head slightly, studying her in the same measured way as the first. "You still misunderstand," it replied. The third presence shifted then, stepping fully into view at last. Its form was clearer now, its gaze fixed directly on Lyra, and there was no mistaking the connection it shared with the others. They were not separate entities, acting independently. They were aligned. "You think this is about you reclaiming something," the first figure continued, its tone calm, almost instructive. "About correcting a wrong." A faint tension moved through the group as it spoke, not visible, but felt, a synchronization that spoke of something deeper than simple cooperation. "You're walking into a structure that has already accounted for you." The implication settled heavily over the courtyard. This was not an isolated confrontation. It was a glimpse, a fraction. Ronan's gaze hardened slightly, his attention no longer divided but focused. He did not step back. He did not yield ground, but the calculation behind his eyes shifted, recognizing the difference between a battle and something far more complex. "This wasn't chance," he said quietly, more to Lyra than to them. "They knew you would awaken." Lyra did not look at him, but she heard him. And she understood. The realization did not weaken her. It clarified everything. Her past, her exile, the events that had led her here, they were no longer random acts of cruelty or misjudgment. They were pieces of something larger, something that had been unfolding long before she became aware of it. Her journey had not simply drawn attention. It had triggered response. The first figure took another step forward, the others remaining just behind it, not as subordinates, but as part of a formation that did not need to be spoken aloud. "You are not restoring anything," it said. "You are stepping into a conflict that has never ended." The courtyard fell silent again, but this time, the silence carried understanding. This was not a fight that would be resolved here. This was not an enemy that would fall with a single confrontation. This was something organized, ancient, deliberate, and far larger than any single pack, any single alpha, or even Lyra herself. The question that lingered now was no longer whether she could defeat them. It was how many more existed beyond what she could see. And more importantly, what they had been preparing for all this time. The weight of what stood before them did not fade, but something within the courtyard began to change. It was not the enemies who shifted first. It was the ground beneath Lyra's feet, the invisible structure of authority that had governed the pack for generations. What had once been rigid and unquestioned now felt unstable, as if it were waiting to be redefined by something stronger than tradition. Lyra remained still for a moment, her gaze fixed on the figures ahead, her power steady, controlled. She did not rush forward, nor did she retreat. The decision forming within her was not driven by urgency, but by clarity. This was no longer a battle she could fight alone. Not because she lacked strength, because the scale of what stood against her demanded something more than individual power. Ronan stepped forward, closing the slight distance between them, his presence unwavering. There was no hesitation in his movement, no uncertainty in his intent. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard with calm authority, not as a command, but as a declaration. "This is no longer just her fight," he said. The pack reacted immediately, their attention shifting toward him, toward the Alpha King who had always stood above them. Yet there was something different in the way he carried himself now. He did not position himself ahead of Lyra, nor did he attempt to take control of the moment. He stood beside her, deliberately, visibly, equal. "I stand with her," he continued, his gaze steady, not on the pack, but on the figures that threatened them all. "Not because she needs protection, but because this concerns every territory, every wolf who believes they understand this world." The words settled heavily, not just for what they said, but for what they changed. The pack saw it clearly. This was not an alpha asserting dominance over another. This was alignment, a choice. And that choice carried more weight than any order ever could. Lyra felt it too. The difference in his presence, the absence of expectation, the refusal to reduce her role to something lesser. He was not offering to lead her. He was offering to stand with her. That distinction mattered. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting his for the briefest moment. There was no need for long explanation, no need for spoken agreement filled with conditions. What passed between them was simpler and far more significant. Understanding. "You're choosing a war you didn't start," she said, her tone measured, not testing him, but acknowledging the reality of what he had just done. Ronan did not look away. "I'm choosing the truth in front of me," he replied, "and I don't ignore threats that reshape the world I lead." There was no hesitation in his answer, no attempt to soften it. He did not frame it as sacrifice, nor did he make it about loyalty alone. It was a decision rooted in responsibility, in awareness, in the recognition that what stood before them would not stop at one pack or one alpha. Lyra studied him for a moment longer. Then she turned back toward the figures ahead, her posture shifting slightly as her decisions settled into place. "I don't need saving," she said, her voice carrying clearly not just to Ronan but to everyone who listened. "I know," he answered without pause. The simplicity of that response removed any doubt. She did not have to prove herself to him. She did not have to fight for recognition. He had already given it. Lyra stepped forward then, not alone this time, but not led either. Ronan moved with her, matching her pace without overtaking it, their presence aligning in a way that did not blur their identities, but strengthened them. The energy around them shifted as a result. Not merging. Balancing. The golden light that surrounded Lyra remained distinct, bright, and steady, while Ronan's presence grounded it, anchoring it without diminishing its intensity. Together, they created something the courtyard had never witnessed before. Not dominance, not rivalry. Partnership. The pack felt it. Wolves who had spent their lives understanding power as something singular, something that must always rise above another, now faced a reality that contradicted everything they had known. Authority did not fracture between them. It expanded. One of the elders, still kneeling, lifted his gaze slightly, confusion evident in his expression. "Who leads?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Lyra did not turn toward him. Ronan did not answer for her. Instead, she spoke, her voice steady, unshaken. "We both do," she said. The simplicity of it carried more force than any declaration of dominance. Because it was not shared out of necessity. It was shared out of choice. Ronan did not add to it, did not redefine it. His silence reinforced it more than words could have. He did not need to claim authority. He already held it. And now he chose to stand with hers. The figures across from them watched the exchange with quiet attention. There was no interruption, no immediate reaction, but something in their stillness suggested that this moment mattered more than any clash of power. They were observing, assessing, because what had just formed was not simply an alliance. It was a structure, a foundation, something that could grow into a force capable of opposing them. Lyra's gaze hardened slightly as she faced them again, her power rising, not in defiance, but in readiness. "I won't follow your system," she said, her voice carrying with quiet certainty. "And I won't replace it with another that mirrors the same flaws." The statement was not directed at the pack. It was directed at the future. Ronan remained beside her, his presence steady, reinforcing the shift without overshadowing it. Whatever came next would not be fought alone. But it would not be controlled by anyone else either. And as the balance between them settled into something real, something stable, one truth became clear to everyone watching. This was no longer a story of a single alpha rising. It was the beginning of something far more difficult to challenge. A power that did not rely on control. A leadership that could not be broken by division. And an alliance that had just turned into a looming threat, into a war they were now ready to face together. The tension did not break. It deepened. The figures across the courtyard remained still, their presence unchanged, their attention fixed. The pack behind Lyra stayed silent, not out of fear alone, but because something greater was unfolding, something that demanded to be witnessed without interruption. Lyra stepped forward. This time, there was no hesitation behind the movement, no internal conflict pulling against her direction. Every step she took carried clarity, as though the uncertainty that had once defined her place in the world had finally burned away, leaving only purpose behind. The ground beneath her feet responded again, not cracking violently as before, but settling into a quiet recognition of her presence. The energy surrounding her did not lash outward. It rose with control, steady and deliberate, expanding just enough to make its existence undeniable without losing its precision. She did not look at the enemies first. She looked at her pack, not as something she belonged to, as something she now led. Her gaze moved across them slowly, meeting the eyes of wolves who had once dismissed her, who had once defined her by weakness and silence. What they saw now was not the memory of who she had been. It was the reality of who she had become. "I spent my life being told what I was," she began, her voice calm, carrying across the courtyard without strain. "I was given a place beneath everyone else, a role that required silence, obedience, and submission." No one moved. No one spoke. Because the truth in her words did not accuse alone, it revealed. "I accepted it," she continued, her tone steady, not defensive, not regretful, but honest. "Not because it was right, but because it was all I was allowed to believe." The faint glow around her intensified slightly, not erupting, not overwhelming, but growing clearer, more defined, as if the energy itself was aligning with the certainty in her voice. Her gaze hardened, just enough to mark the shift. That ends now. The words did not echo, but they settled with weight. Final. Unyielding. Lyra turned then, her focus shifting from the pack to the figures before her, to the threat that had revealed the truth behind everything she had endured. Her posture remained composed, her presence unwavering, but there was something different in the way she held herself now. She was no longer reacting. She was defining. "I am not what you tried to erase," she said, her voice carrying further this time, reaching both allies and enemies alike. "I am not the weakness you built your system around." The golden light around her sharpened, not expanding wildly, but becoming more focused, more precise, as if it had found its true shape. "I am what remained." The statement was not a challenge. It was a declaration. Behind her, the pack felt the shift as clearly as they had felt the pressure before. This was no longer about power being proven through force. It was about identity being established in a way that could not be undone. Ronan watched her closely, not with concern but with recognition. He did not step forward. He did not speak. This moment did not belong to him. It belonged to her. Cale felt it too, though in a different way. What stood before him now bore no resemblance to the woman he had rejected. Not because she had gained power, but because she had claimed something far more important. Authority over herself. Lyra took another step forward, her gaze steady, her voice unwavering. "You built a world that rewards control without responsibility," she said, addressing the figures ahead, but not limiting the truth to them alone. "You removed what you could not dominate and replaced it with something easier to manage." There was no anger in her tone. Only certainty. "I am not here to fit into that system," she continued, "and I am not here to repeat it." The energy around her settled again, not diminishing, but stabilizing into something that felt permanent, grounded. It no longer surged in reaction to threat or emotion. It existed as part of her, inseparable from the identity she had just defined. Her gaze did not waver. "I am not surviving this," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any raised voice could have. "I am leading it." The silence that followed was absolute. Not empty. Complete. Because in that moment, the transformation was no longer something that could be questioned or challenged. It was finished. She was no longer the Omega who endured. She was the Alpha who decided what came next. The silence that followed her declaration did not feel empty. It felt like a threshold. Lyra stood at its center, her presence steady, her power no longer rising or clashing, but settled into something deeper, something that did not need to prove itself anymore. The courtyard remained still around her, the pack unmoving, the enemies watching, as if the entire world had paused to acknowledge what she had just become. And then, something shifted. Not outside. Within her. At first, it was subtle. A faint pull beneath the surface of her awareness, like a distant echo brushing against the edges of her mind. It did not feel like the awakening she had already endured. This was quieter, older, patient. Her breath slowed. The golden energy surrounding her flickered, not weakening, not unstable, but reacting to something far beneath it. Her gaze sharpened, though she did not move, her focus turning inward as the sensation deepened. Ronan noticed immediately. The change was slight, almost imperceptible, but he had learned to read the smallest shifts in her presence. His posture adjusted, not stepping in, not interrupting, but ready, aware that whatever was happening now was not part of the battle they had prepared for. "Lyra," he said quietly, his voice steady, careful not to break whatever was unfolding. She did not answer, because she was no longer fully there. The courtyard faded at the edges of her awareness, replaced by something else entirely. Darkness. Not the absence of light, but something vast, stretching beyond anything she could measure. It did not threaten her. It did not consume her. It simply existed, waiting as though it had always been there, just beyond reach. And within it, a presence. Not like the others. Not like the figures who stood before her. This was older. Deeper. It did not press against her. It did not test her strength. It recognized her. The moment that connection formed, the world around her seemed to fall away completely. A voice followed. Not spoken aloud. Not carried through the air. It resonated within her, calm and absolute, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself. You have begun to understand. The words were not loud, yet they filled every part of her awareness, leaving no space untouched. Lyra's breath caught slightly, not in fear, but in realization. This was not an enemy. This was not an observer. This was something tied to her. Something that had always been part of her. "What are you?" she asked, though her voice did not leave her lips, existing only within that shared space. The presence did not hesitate. "I am what remains," it answered. "What endures beyond those who were lost and those who were hunted." Fragments of memory stirred again, but this time they did not rush past her in chaos. They unfolded slowly, deliberately, revealing pieces of something far larger than she had first believed. She saw the ancient bloodline again. Not just its fall, its origin. Something had existed before even the first alphas. Something that had not been erased. Something that could not be. Her pulse steadied as the realization settled into place. "I'm not the last," she said, the understanding forming clearly now. The presence responded without hesitation. "No." A pause followed, not for effect, but for truth to take shape. "You are not the end of this bloodline." The darkness around her shifted slightly, not changing, but revealing more of its depth. "You are the key to what it was meant to become." The words did not echo. They anchored. And with them came a realization far more dangerous than anything she had faced so far. This was never about survival alone. It was not even about restoration. It was about something unfinished. Something that had been waiting for her. Lyra's eyes snapped open. The courtyard rushed back into focus, the presence of the pack, the enemies, Ronan at her side, all of it returning at once. But something had changed. Not visibly. Not yet. But it was there. Ronan stepped closer, his voice lower now, edged with concern he did not attempt to hide. "What just happened?" Lyra did not answer immediately. Her gaze lifted slowly, not toward him, not toward the pack, but toward the figures that still stood across from her. For the first time since they had appeared, something in her expression shifted, not uncertainty, not fear, but recognition of a different kind. Not of them. Of what stood beyond them. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried a weight that silenced everything around her. "This isn't just about them," she said. The figures remained still, but something in their posture changed, almost imperceptibly, as if they sensed the shift as well. Lyra's gaze hardened slightly. It never was. The air tightened again, not from immediate conflict, but from what those words implied. Because the question was no longer how many enemies stood before her. It was how far this truly went. And somewhere beyond what any of them could see. Something had just awakened with her,